Remember what we practiced. Look at the judge and speak clearly into the mic. You'll be fine.
Have you ever wondered how quickly the world you trust can collapse, how a perfectly ordinary morning can hide something terrifying beneath its quiet surface? What if the danger wasn't outside your home, but sitting at your own breakfast table? And what would you do if the last person you ever expected to fear was your own child? These are the unsettling questions that echo through homes everywhere, because no one ever imagines their family could fracture in a way that leaves scars for generations. And yet, on a normal spring afternoon in Boise, Idaho, a tragedy unfolded that would haunt a community forever. Our title, 14-year-old girl gets life sentence for killing brother, isn't chosen for shock. It's chosen because it represents the unbearable truth at the heart of this story. An unthinkable act committed by someone barely old enough to understand the weight of her own choices. And the thumbnail phrase, "the verdict broke her," reflects a moment where childhood vanished in an instant, when the consequences finally caught up to the silent storm that had been brewing inside her. But before the courtroom, before the sentence, before the collapse of a family, there was a house on an ordinary street, and a discovery so devastating it froze the entire neighborhood in disbelief. On April 5, 2010, the calm suburban street of Aspen Ridge Drive filled with flashing red and blue lights as first responders rushed toward a home where a frantic mother had just found her 8-year-old son unresponsive on the hallway floor. The boy, Brittany Ringstaff, was cold to the touch. His mother screamed his name as neighbors sprinted from their porches, trying to understand what had gone wrong in a place where nothing ever did. Paramedics worked quickly, but there was nothing left to save. Within minutes, the whispers began, because something about the scene didn't look right, something didn't add up, and someone inside that house seemed far too calm for what had just happened. But what investigators would uncover next wouldn't just raise questions. It would expose a chilling truth hiding in plain sight, and point directly toward someone no one was prepared to suspect. Every tragedy has a beginning, and sometimes it hides inside the most ordinary moments. The soft clatter of breakfast plates, the hurried footsteps of parents running late, the easy arguments siblings toss back and forth without thinking. That was the Ringstaff household on the morning everything changed. Nothing looked dangerous, nothing felt unusual, and yet beneath the surface of that routine Monday, a storm was already forming inside a girl who felt the world had turned against her. 14-year-old Brittany Ringstaff woke up to a day that should have been as unremarkable as any other, but a single moment of annoyance would ignite a flame she wasn't equipped to control. As the family rushed to grab cereal and pack lunches, her 8-year-old brother Jeremy reached across the table, just a careless, innocent reach, and knocked Brittany's phone off the counter. It hit the floor with a sickening snap, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of cracks. For most kids, a broken phone is an inconvenience. For Brittany, whose entire teenage identity rested behind that glowing screen, it felt like a personal attack. Her voice rose, her hands shook, and the panic of losing something she depended on so deeply twisted instantly into anger. But when their mother stepped in, she didn't take Brittany's side. She took the phone away completely and grounded her for the weekend. That moment, small as it seems, became the emotional trigger that shifted the entire day's fate. Brittany's glare burned into her brother, her whisper cold enough to silence the room. "You'll pay for this." Her parents brushed it off as teenage dramatics, the kind every household hears and forgets. They were already late for work, rushing out the door, unaware that those words would soon carry a meaning far darker than anyone imagined. To them, it was just sibling irritation. To Brittany, it became a promise. And as their car engines faded down the street, the house fell into a quiet that would soon become deadly. Because once the front door closed, Brittany wasn't thinking about school anymore. She was thinking about revenge, and what she did next would set a deadly plan in motion. There are moments we brush aside, words spoken in anger, whispered threats we assume will dissolve with time. Parents hear them, shake their heads, and move on. But sometimes the danger isn't in the volume of a threat, it's in the quiet way it's delivered. After Brittany hissed those chilling words, "You'll pay for this," the Ringstaff home fell into its usual morning chaos. Charles hurried Jeremy into the car for school drop-off. Heather tried calming Brittany while reminding her that broken phones and bad moods didn't excuse outbursts. To them, it was all temporary teenage frustration. They'd heard it before, they expected to hear it again. What they didn't see was the way Brittany's expression didn't soften after the argument, it hardened. The punishment she received only deepened her resentment, turning irritation into something sharper, something colder. And while her parents believed grounding was the end of the conflict, it was only the beginning. When the cars finally pulled away from the driveway, leaving Brittany alone on the front porch, the air around her seemed to shift. The street was peaceful, but her thoughts were not. Inside her mind, anger mixed with humiliation, and humiliation mixed with something far more dangerous, a desire to make Jeremy feel the same pain she felt in that moment. In most homes, these emotions fade within minutes. But in Brittany, they festered. All morning long, she replayed her mother's scolding, her brother's clumsy accident, and the sting of losing her phone, the one object she believed held her entire world. Each replay twisted her memories tighter, reshaping an ordinary sibling disagreement into a deep betrayal. And while the adults assumed Brittany would cool off and go to school, she stood in that quiet house making a decision that would forever redefine her family's life. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't impulsive. It was the moment the boundary between anger and intention quietly dissolved. Because instead of heading to school like she was told, Brittany picked up the phone, and what she said next would prove she wasn't just angry, she was planning something far more calculated. Some of the most dangerous decisions don't begin with violence, they begin with a lie. A soft, calculated lie told with a steady voice that hides intentions no one sees coming. As soon as Brittany found herself alone in the quiet house, anger didn't fade the way it does for most teenagers. Instead, it sharpened into focus. She wasn't thinking about consequences, school assignments, or the grounding her mother had imposed. She was thinking about the one thing she still had control over, the story she could tell. And that's when she made the first move in what would later be recognized as a disturbingly methodical plan. She picked up the phone and dialed her school's attendance office, softening her tone, mimicking her mother's voice with unsettling accuracy. Calm, steady, rehearsed. "Brittany isn't feeling well today," she said. "She'll be staying home to rest." The staff accepted the explanation without question. Why wouldn't they? Children don't typically impersonate their own parents, but Brittany wasn't done, not even close. Just minutes later, she placed a second call, this time to Jeremy's elementary school. Same false voice, same practiced worry. Only this time the message was far more urgent. There was a family emergency, and Jeremy needed to be released early. The office staff complied. Why suspect anything? It was a request they heard often enough, parents pulling kids out for sudden issues, quick errands, unexpected situations. But for Jeremy, this phone call would become the first step toward a trap he had no idea he was walking into. Investigators would later marvel at the precision of her impersonation, the confidence in her tone, the calmness in her lies. Not the behavior of someone acting on impulse, but of someone who had already begun to shape the day exactly the way she wanted. By the time she hung up the phone, the path ahead was cleared. Jeremy would be alone with her. No teachers. No parents, no witnesses. Just opportunity. The opportunity she had been quietly building from the moment the front door closed behind her parents. And as she left the house, heading not toward her own school but toward Jeremy's, the world around her carried on normally, completely unaware that she was already walking toward the next step of her deadly plan. Sometimes the most chilling moments are the ones that look completely ordinary from the outside. Quiet streets, familiar bus stops, the simple rhythm of daily life continuing while something far darker moves beneath the surface. After making the two deceptive phone calls, Brittany stepped out of the house with a calmness that later stunned investigators. She didn't run, she didn't hide. She simply walked down the street, blending into the soft hum of a suburban morning. Neighbors going about their day had no idea the teenage girl striding past them had just set something horrifying into motion. Security footage from a nearby home captured her heading toward the bus stop, nothing unusual at first glance. A girl with a backpack, hands in her pockets, moving with the slow confidence of someone who had rehearsed her next steps. Her school bus wasn't coming for her. She wasn't waiting to go to class. Instead, she boarded a public bus headed in the opposite direction, toward Jeremy's elementary school. It was a flawless move, one that allowed her to bypass questions and slip into her next role without hesitation. By 10:30 a.m., she walked into the school office, relaxed and composed, still using her mother's voice to explain why she needed her little brother early. Staff members later recalled how calm she appeared, how nothing seemed out of place. Jeremy walked out moments later, confused but trusting. He didn't question why his sister, who wasn't supposed to pick him up, suddenly appeared with news of a family emergency. He simply followed her because that's what younger siblings do. The two were captured on a convenience store camera soon after, buying a soda and candy bars. A normal moment. A sibling outing that looked innocent to everyone who saw it. Jeremy didn't know he was living the last ordinary minutes of his life. And Brittany, she didn't show a flicker of fear, hesitation, or second thoughts. Every step she took looked deliberate, almost rehearsed, like she was quietly setting the stage for what she already knew she was going to do. But once the bus dropped them back in their neighborhood, the world outside faded, and inside that silent house, Brittany's real plan finally began to unfold. There's something unsettling about a familiar home when the wrong intentions are inside it. Doors look the same, Rooms feel the same, but the atmosphere changes. Quiet becomes heavy, walls seem to listen, and innocence has no idea it's walking into danger. When Brittany unlocked the front door and led Jeremy inside, nothing about her demeanor suggested panic or hesitation. Instead, she moved through the house with a strange calmness, one investigators later described as chillingly controlled for a 14-year-old. Jeremy, still believing the lie about a family emergency, waited for answers that never came. To keep him distracted, Brittany suggested they watch some TV until their parents sorted things out. It was a lie meant to keep him close, to make sure he didn't wander or ask too many questions. While he sat on the couch, unaware of the storm gathering around him, Brittany slipped away upstairs. Behind the closed bathroom door, she turned on the tap. The tub filled slowly, the sound blending with the hum of the house, ordinary, harmless, familiar. But her intentions were anything but. She would later claim that Jeremy wanted a bath because he got dirty at recess, a story she repeated again and again. But the truth was far different. The water running into that deep soaking tub wasn't meant for comfort. It wasn't meant for play. It was part of a plan she had been shaping since morning. The bathroom itself was ordinary. Sliding glass doors, polished tiles, the kind of space families walk past 100 times without thinking. Yet in just minutes, this simple room would become the setting of something unthinkable. And as the water level rose, so did the danger Jeremy still didn't know he was in. When Brittany finally called him upstairs, there was no alarm in his voice, no hesitation. Why would there be? This was his home. She was his sister. He trusted her, but the moment Jeremy stepped into that bathroom, trust became a weapon, and in the silence that followed, only one of them understood what was truly about to happen. There are places in every home that feel safe. Bedrooms, living rooms, the familiar bathroom where a child plays with bubbles and toys without a single fear in the world. But safety can vanish in seconds when the person standing beside you doesn't feel like family anymore. As Jeremy stepped into the upstairs bathroom, nothing looked alarming. The tub was filled, the room warm, the glass shower doors glistening with steam. But the innocence of that scene was a mask, hiding the real purpose of the water Brittany had been preparing. What happened next is known only because of the evidence his small body left behind, evidence that told investigators a story more brutal than any confession ever could. Jeremy never undressed. His clothes were still on when first responders found him later, proving he hadn't walked into that bathroom expecting a bath. It means he didn't willingly climb into the tub. He was forced. The bathroom floor and walls would later show the signs of a struggle, water splashed far beyond anything a child could cause by accident. A violent fight had taken place. Jeremy fought for his life. But the most heartbreaking clues were the ones found on his sister. Under Brittany's fingernails, investigators discovered Jeremy's blood. On her clothing, microscopic spatters marked her involvement in a desperate battle that lasted far longer than any child should ever have to endure. Medical examiners determined Jeremy had been held underwater for at least 3 agonizing minutes, conscious, aware, terrified. He scratched at Brittany's arms, clawed at anything he could reach, even dragging his nails against the smooth porcelain tub in a final attempt to pull himself out. His resistance was determined, but she was stronger, and she had already made her decision. Behind the sliding glass doors, in a room meant for warmth and routine, a child's last moments unfolded in absolute silence, so silent that not a single neighbor heard a scream. Not a single sound escaped those walls, but the horror didn't end with the drowning, because once Jeremy's small body grew still, Brittany didn't panic. She began planning her next move. When most people face a moment of tragedy, panic sets in. Hearts race, hands shake, and the mind scrambles for help. But what chilled investigators about Brittany was not just what she did in the bathroom, it was what she did after. There was no frantic call for help, no attempt to revive Jeremy, no trembling shock at what had just happened. Instead, she shifted instantly into something disturbingly calculated. The girl who had just drowned her brother didn't collapse in fear. She began cleaning. Jeremy's small body, still dripping with bathwater, was dragged from the tub and placed in the hallway outside the bathroom. The position she chose was deliberate. She wanted it to look like he had slipped after a bath, fallen, and died accidentally. But the clues she left behind told a different story. His clothes were still on. The water patterns didn't match a simple fall. And the bruises found later didn't lie. After moving him, Brittany turned her attention to herself. The clothes she wore during the struggle were stained with microscopic traces of Jeremy's blood, traces she believed she could wash away. She carried them downstairs and tossed them into the washing machine, running a full cycle in an attempt to erase the evidence. Investigators would later find those clothes still damp, still carrying traces of the truth she tried to destroy. Her understanding of forensic science was incomplete, and that would become her undoing. She changed into clean clothes, tidied parts of the bathroom, and wiped surfaces with unsettling composure. Hours passed. Yes, hours. While her brother lay dead in the hallway, Brittany wasn't grieving. She wasn't frozen in regret. She watched TV, she ate, she waited, as if nothing horrific had happened at all. To neighbors and investigators, this calmness, this cold detachment, became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Even seasoned officers struggled to comprehend how a 14-year-old could move from murder to meticulous cleanup, as if it were a chore on her afternoon list. But the act she couldn't control was the one that came next, because when her mother unexpectedly returned home, the carefully staged lie Brittany built began to crumble in seconds. There are moments that split a life into before and after, moments that take everything familiar and twist it into something unrecognizable. For Heather Ringstaff, that moment arrived at 2:15 p.m. on an otherwise quiet afternoon. She wasn't supposed to come home early, but when both schools called asking why neither child had shown up, confusion turned into concern, and concern into urgency. She drove home expecting a misunderstanding. What she found instead would haunt her forever. The front door creaked open into an unsettling silence. No TV, no laughter, no footsteps, just stillness. She called out Jeremy's name, no response. Called for Brittany, silence. Then she climbed the stairs, and the world she knew collapsed beneath her. Jeremy's small body lay motionless in the hallway outside the bathroom, his clothes damp, his skin a chilling shade no mother should ever see. In that instant, Heather's voice cracked into screams that pierced through the quiet neighborhood, sending shockwaves down the street. Neighbors dropped everything, tools, dishes, conversations, and ran toward the source of the desperate cries. One neighbor, a retired nurse, immediately recognized the horrific truth. Jeremy had been gone for hours. Heather didn't want to hear it. She dropped to her knees, performing frantic CPR, begging her son to breathe, begging the nightmare to stop. The nurse gently pulled her back, knowing it was too late. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but their faces told the same story. There was no heartbeat to save, no breath to recover. Meanwhile, as this chaos unfolded, Brittany stood in the doorway. No tears, no panic, just a blank, unsettling calmness that witnesses would later describe as haunting. She didn't run to her mother. She didn't explain. She simply watched, almost detached from the devastation she had caused. The paramedics assessed the scene, confusion flickering across their faces. A child dead, a wet floor, a staged pattern that didn't match what they were hearing. Something wasn't right. Something felt wrong the moment they stepped inside. And when investigators arrived minutes later, it took only one look at the scene to realize this wasn't a tragic accident, but the beginning of a much darker truth. Some investigators walk into a scene and simply observe the facts. Others walk in and feel the truth. Detective Adrian Mitchell was the second kind. 15 years in law enforcement had sharpened not just his eyes, but his instincts. And the moment he stepped into the Ringstaff home at 2:43 p.m., something felt terribly wrong. The house was too quiet, too controlled, too staged. Jeremy's small body lay in the hallway exactly where paramedics had found him, but the scene around him told a story that didn't match Brittany's explanation. The bathroom floor was soaked, but in a splashed, chaotic pattern that suggested struggle, not a fall. The tub's waterline was uneven. The evidence didn't align with the idea of a child slipping after a bath. And then there was Brittany. Mitchell noticed her immediately. While her mother was nearly collapsing in grief and neighbors hovered in shock, Brittany sat silently on the staircase, expressionless, composed, detached. Not a single visible sign of the panic or confusion expected from a sister who had just witnessed a fatal accident. Mitchell's report later described her demeanor in one chilling sentence. Her emotional response was inconsistent with the circumstances, and that was putting it gently. When he began a preliminary interview with her in the living room, her story came out stiff, rehearsed, as if she had practiced it in her head. "I was sick," she claimed. "Jeremy came home early. He slipped. I found him like that." But her eyes avoided his. Her tone didn't waver. And most concerning of all, she showed no signs of fever, no symptoms of illness, nothing to support the story she clung to. Mitchell continued observing her while crime scene techs moved through the house. And that's when the first damning piece of evidence emerged: blood under Brittany's fingernails. Not a smear, not a drop, but dried traces embedded deep beneath her nails. The technician quietly informed the detective. Mitchell didn't react outwardly, but inside, the case shifted instantly. Innocent people don't usually have the victim's blood lodged under their nails, especially not in a drowning. And this was only the beginning, because the more questions Mitchell asked, the more Brittany's carefully built story began to crack, revealing a truth she wouldn't be able to hide much longer. When someone is telling the truth, their story stays steady. Details may shift under stress, but the core never wavers. But when Detective Mitchell sat across from Brittany Ringstaff and gently asked her to explain what happened, her version of events didn't just waver, it reshaped itself every time he pressed a little deeper. At first, she insisted she'd stayed home because of a fever, even though she showed no symptoms. Then she claimed Jeremy returned home early because he felt sick, something the school had already contradicted. And when Mitchell calmly pointed out the inconsistencies, Brittany adjusted her story again, as though she were flipping through excuses trying to find the one that fit. She spoke in a monotone, staring past the detective instead of at him, her flat effect unsettling even to seasoned professionals. Nothing about her emotional state aligned with the horror unfolding around her. The contradictions grew more alarming when the crime scene technician whispered the finding that changed the tone of the interview entirely. Dried blood under Brittany's fingernails, along with tiny stains on the cuffs of her sweatshirt. When Mitchell mentioned this evidence, she barely reacted, only blinked, paused, and offered yet another explanation. "I must have touched him when I tried to help," she said, though moments earlier she had claimed she didn't touch his body at all. Her statements clashed with the realities of drowning victims, who rarely bleed in the way her version implied. Mitchell didn't challenge her with anger. He simply continued to ask the questions that stretched her story thinner and thinner. The more she spoke, the more apparent it became. The truth wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from the evidence she couldn't control, and every attempt she made to redirect suspicion only pulled her deeper into it. The adults around her could feel it, the quiet collapse of a lie that couldn't support its own weight. But the evidence under her nails was just a warning sign, because once the medical examiner began examining Jeremy's body, the truth of what really happened in that bathroom would become undeniable. In every suspicious death, the body becomes the final witness, the one place where truth can't be edited, rehearsed, or rearranged. And when the medical examiner began examining 8-year-old Jeremy Ringstaff, that silent witness spoke louder than anything Brittany had said so far. The first detail was impossible to ignore. Jeremy's clothes were still on. A child doesn't take a bath fully dressed. That fact alone destroyed Brittany's claim that he simply fell while bathing. But the deeper the examiner looked, the more horrifying the picture became. Jeremy's skin showed fresh scratches, small but desperate marks across his forearms and hands, the kind a child makes when fighting to break free from something holding him down. These weren't the wounds of a fall. They were the wounds of survival instincts. Then came the bruising. Dark, fresh, patterned bruises across his shoulders and upper back, marks that aligned almost perfectly with the size and placement of someone pressing down with force. These bruises told the story Jeremy never had the chance to speak. Someone had held him underwater, hard. The most devastating revelation came from his lungs. They were filled with bathwater, not just traces, significant amounts. Evidence that Jeremy was alive and breathing when he was submerged. Evidence that he fought. Evidence that he suffered. The examiner estimated he remained conscious for at least 3 minutes while drowning. 3 minutes. For an adult, that is an eternity of terror. For a child, it's unimaginable. Each second of that timeline contradicted every word Brittany had told investigators. And when the medical examiner added one more detail, that the scratches on Jeremy's skin contained microscopic fragments matching Brittany's DNA, her version of events didn't just collapse, it imploded. The body had spoken. The truth was no longer negotiable. But the autopsy was only the beginning, because once investigators checked with both schools, they uncovered a deception so deliberate it revealed exactly how much planning Brittany had done before Jeremy ever stepped into that house. Sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't left on a body, or a floor, or a wall. It lives in the digital footprints people think will stay private. And when investigators began examining Brittany Ringstaff's phone, they uncovered a storm of resentment simmering long before the morning of Jeremy's death. What they found wasn't a sudden burst of anger, but a pattern. Her messages to friends were filled with bitterness, frustration, and a sense of injustice that had been building for months. In one early morning text on the day of the murder, she wrote, "I hate him so much right now. He's going to be sorry he ever touched my stuff." At first glance, it could have been dismissed as typical teenage exaggeration, but in the context of what came next, those words turned chilling. She followed it with another message minutes later. Parents always take his side. It wasn't just anger, it was fixation. Jeremy wasn't just a little brother who annoyed her. In her messages, he became the symbol of everything she believed was unfair in her life. And then investigators found the message that shifted everything from emotional outburst to sinister intent. "I'm going to make him sorry he was ever born." Her friend, interviewed later, said she'd never taken Brittany seriously, because teenagers often say dramatic things when they're upset, but investigators believed Brittany meant every word. And the evidence kept stacking. The phone she had tried to hide under her mattress after the murder still held deleted messages that forensic teams recovered. Messages filled with quiet threats, growing resentment, and the early traces of a motive that no one had seen forming. This wasn't simply a reaction to a broken phone. It was the culmination of a long-standing emotional imbalance, an unhealthy reliance on her device, an obsession with social validation, and a feeling that Jeremy was the cause of every punishment she faced. And when her parents took his side that morning, the anger she'd nurtured didn't just boil over, it snapped. Her digital trail didn't just reveal motive, it revealed premeditation. But the most devastating proof of her planning wasn't in her messages, it was in what she had typed into a search. By late afternoon, the Ringstaff house had become a crime scene, yellow tape fluttering in the breeze, officers moving in and out, neighbors gathering along the curb in silent disbelief. But nothing was more devastating than the moment Charles Ringstaff pulled into the driveway at 4:30 p.m., unaware that his life was about to fracture beyond repair. He stepped out of the car expecting to find a misunderstanding, maybe an accident, maybe a medical emergency. Instead, he saw police units crowding his street, paramedics carrying equipment they no longer needed, and his wife sitting on the curb, sedated and trembling, supported by two EMTs. One look at her face and he knew. Parents always know. His knees hit the grass before anyone could catch him. Witnesses later described a sound leaving his chest that didn't resemble anything human, raw grief, disbelieving, guttural. The kind of sound that stays with you, even years later. Officers tried to steady him, but he pushed past them, stumbling toward the front door as if sheer willpower could undo the nightmare waiting inside. He didn't get far. A detective blocked his path. "You can't go in there," they said softly, and the truth hit him all over again. His little boy gone, the family he left behind that morning destroyed, but the most haunting detail wasn't inside the house. It was standing right in front of him. Brittany, his daughter, his child, the same girl he dropped off at the bus stop countless mornings. The same girl who had laughed at silly jokes, shared inside family memories, and complained about homework like every other teenager. She stood beside a patrol car, expression blank, emotion unreadable, hands fidgeting not from fear but from restraint. A neighbor later recalled hearing her whisper, almost to herself, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Those words became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Because they didn't come from panic. They came from realization, the realization that her carefully constructed story was collapsing. Detectives placed Brittany into a vehicle, not as a criminal yet, but as someone whose answers were no longer lining up with the truth unfolding around her. But once she arrived at the police station, the lies she'd memorized began to fall apart, because investigators were ready with evidence she never expected them to find. At the Boise Police Department, Brittany Ringstaff wasn't taken to a cold metal room like in crime shows. Juveniles were questioned in a softer space, comfortable chairs, muted colors, a calm environment designed to reduce fear. But the atmosphere didn't matter. The truth still had weight, and in that room it pressed down on her harder than anything she had faced before. Detective Adrian Mitchell sat across from her, patient, steady, watching every blink, every hesitation. A juvenile advocate sat nearby, her attorney beside her, yet none of that seemed to rattle Brittany. If anything, she seemed annoyed, like answering questions was an inconvenience, not a matter of life and death. Her first version of events did not match what she told officers at the house. Now she claimed Jeremy had been running around the bathroom, slipped, hit his head, and fallen into the water. But Mitchell had already seen Jeremy's body. He had seen the bruises, the scratches, the lack of head injury. Nothing about her story matched the evidence. When he pointed out these inconsistencies, Brittany didn't panic. She simply shifted again, adjusting the details as if she were rewriting a story in real time. "I tried to help him," she added suddenly. "That's how the blood got under my nails," except she had previously insisted she never touched him. And drowning victims don't bleed the way her explanation required. Her contradictions stacked on top of each other, and Mitchell quietly let them build, knowing that eventually she'd run out of space to maneuver. That moment came when he placed photographs on the table, close-ups of the dried blood beneath her fingernails. She stared at them, blinking rapidly, not crying, not shaking, just recalculating. "He must have been bleeding when he slipped," she tried again. But Mitchell didn't argue. He didn't have to. He gently reminded her that the medical team had found no injuries consistent with her claim. Her silence stretched long enough that her attorney advised her to stop talking. But Brittany didn't stop. She kept twisting the story, one version after another, each one contradicting the last. And just when investigators thought they'd heard every possible lie, they uncovered the one thing Brittany couldn't talk her way around, because her own internet search history revealed a darker truth she had tried desperately to hide. Every crime leaves clues, but some of the most revealing aren't fingerprints or bloodstains, they're keystrokes. Digital footprints that feel invisible in the moment, but remain permanently etched into a device. And when investigators pulled Brittany Ringstaff's internet records, the story she'd been trying to protect unraveled in seconds. Her searches didn't appear once or twice in a moment of panic. They appeared over multiple days. 3 days before Jeremy's death, Brittany had typed, "Can someone drown in a bathtub?" Later that same day, "How long does it take someone to drown?" Not questions of curiosity, questions of preparation. The next morning, the day before the murder, another search. How to make drowning look like an accident. And then, on the morning Jeremy died, after her parents left, after the argument, after the grounding, the most devastating search of all. Do police check fingerprints in bathtub drownings? These weren't the makings of a sudden snap. They were steps in a plan, steps she believed she could carry out without consequences. Investigators stared at the timeline in disbelief. A 14-year-old had researched a method of killing her brother with the same casual rhythm another teen might search for homework help. And while Brittany was spinning new versions of her story in the interview room, detectives were watching a digital roadmap of her intentions scroll across the screen. Her attorney had no explanation. Brittany had no explanation, because there was none. It was the kind of evidence that spoke louder than any confession. It proved forethought. It proved planning. It proved the drowning wasn't an accident or a moment of uncontrollable rage. She had been thinking about it, searching about it, preparing for it. The silence in the room after Mitchell slid the printed search list toward her was the first true crack in Brittany's composure. She asked for a break. Her mask was slipping. The truth was cornering her. And when she returned to the room, shaken and exposed, detectives placed the final, undeniable piece of evidence in front of her, autopsy photos that revealed exactly how Jeremy spent the last minutes of his life. When Brittany returned from the short break, something in her demeanor had shifted. The confidence, the irritation, the rehearsed calm, they were all thinning, like a mask losing its grip. Detective Mitchell didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her. Instead, he placed a folder on the table, slowly, deliberately, as if laying down the final truth she could no longer step around. Inside were the autopsy photographs. Not the graphic ones, just the ones showing the bruises across Jeremy's shoulders, the dark pressure marks where knees had pinned him down, the scratches that told the story of a child fighting with everything he had. Mitchell slid them toward her without a word. Brittany's eyes locked onto the images and stayed there. Seconds passed, then longer. Her breathing changed, faster, uneven, almost jittery. It was the first sign of emotional reaction since this began, but it wasn't grief. It was fear. Fear of being cornered, fear of being seen. Mitchell leaned forward quietly. "These bruises tell us he was held down," he said. "They didn't come from a fall. They didn't come from trying to help him. Someone pressed him into that water." Brittany's lips trembled. Her attorney whispered urgently beside her, telling her not to say anything. But the silence had cracked open something inside her. "He broke my phone," she whispered, her first real admission of motive. "Everything I had was on that phone, all my friends, my pictures, everything." Her voice didn't tremble from guilt. It trembled from anger resurfacing, from entitlement, from resentment she had carried far too tightly. "And then I got grounded," she continued, tears now streaking down her face, but not the kind that mourn a dead brother. The kind that mourn consequences. "I didn't plan for him to die," she said, despite the internet searches proving otherwise. "I just wanted to scare him. But he kept fighting, he wouldn't stop." The confession wasn't clean or complete. It was fragmented, distorted, drenched in self-pity. But it was enough. Enough to reveal intention. Enough to confirm what forensic evidence already proved. Enough to strip away every lie she had spent the day building. But the nightmare was far from over, because once the confession ended, Brittany still had to face the courtroom, where the truth she couldn't escape would become the truth the entire world would judge. By the time Brittany Ringstaff's trial began, Boise had transformed into the epicenter of a national conversation. News vans lined the streets, reporters crowded the courthouse steps, and public opinion fractured into two extremes. Those who saw a child who made a catastrophic mistake, and those who saw a cold, calculated killer. Inside courtroom 3A, however, the noise of the outside world faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. For the first time, Brittany faced not investigators, not her parents, not a single detective. She faced 12 strangers who would decide her future. She walked in wearing clothes chosen carefully by her defense team, plain, modest, intentionally non-threatening. Her hair was pulled back simply, makeup removed, the teenage edge stripped away. They wanted the jury to see a child, but the prosecution intended to show them something else entirely. When Judge Harrington entered, his stern presence cut through the room. He reminded everyone, press included, that despite Brittany's age, this was an adult trial, a first-degree murder case, and the evidence would speak for itself. Then Prosecutor Elizabeth Howard stood. Her voice was calm at first, steady, controlled, until she began describing Jeremy's final moments. The jury saw Jeremy not as a case file, but as an 8-year-old boy who trusted the sister who held him down. Howard didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The autopsy photos, the bruises, the timeline, the internet searches, they were devastating enough. This was not an accident, she said firmly. This was not a moment of panic. This was a plan. Every word landed like a blow. Brittany stared down at the table, unmoving. She had sat emotionless during police questioning, but here, the weight of the room pressed visibly against her shoulders. Her defense attorney followed with a softer approach, urging the jury to see her youth, her undeveloped brain, her inability to fully grasp the permanence of death. But no matter how compelling the psychology, the facts were immovable. The courtroom became a battlefield, science versus emotion, motive versus immaturity, punishment versus rehabilitation. And as the opening statements ended, one truth became clear. This trial wasn't just about what Brittany did. It was about what the justice system believed a 14-year-old was capable of. But the true turning point came next, when experts took the stand and revealed the forensic evidence so clearly that even the defense struggled to push again. If the prosecution's goal was to prove deliberate cruelty, the defense had only one possible path forward: convince the jury that Brittany Ringstaff was not a cold-hearted killer, but a child whose brain wasn't capable of adult-level planning. And they leaned heavily into that narrative from the moment the trial began. Defense attorney Patricia Reynolds approached the jury with quiet, almost maternal energy, her tone gentle, her expressions soft, her steps deliberate. She didn't deny the tragedy. She didn't excuse Brittany's actions. Instead, she reframed them. She spoke about how adolescent brains function, how impulse often overrides reason, how emotional storms in teenagers feel like life-or-death battles. This is not a monster, she told the jury. This is a child. The defense argued that Brittany's world revolved around her phone, and when it shattered, and when her parents grounded her, that emotional eruption overwhelmed her ability to think rationally. They insisted the drowning was a moment of rage, not a calculated act, but the prosecution had already shown the search history, the text messages, the impersonated phone calls, the staged crime scene. Actions that didn't fit the profile of an overwhelmed teenager acting on impulse. Still, the defense pressed on, bringing in a forensic psychologist who emphasized the science. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, isn't fully developed at 14. Teenagers often act without truly understanding consequences, he explained. Even severe consequences. It was a compelling argument, one that resonated with several jurors who were parents themselves. They understood teenage emotion. They understood impulsivity. They understood how irrational a young mind could be when faced with embarrassment or punishment. But even as the defense painted this sympathetic picture, a darker reality hung over the room. Brittany hadn't simply reacted. She'd planned. She'd researched, she'd executed, and she'd tried to erase the evidence afterward. Could a teenager do all that and still be considered incapable of premeditation? That was the question the defense desperately needed the jury to believe. But the next witnesses would make that nearly impossible, because when medical and forensic experts testified, they dismantled every argument that this was an impulsive act. When the prosecution called their expert witnesses, the atmosphere in courtroom 3A shifted. Emotion stepped aside, and cold, clinical truth took its place. First to the stand was Dr. Priya Charma, the medical examiner whose autopsy findings had already shaken investigators. But hearing her describe Jeremy's final moments out loud, in front of the jury, was something entirely different. In a steady, controlled voice, she explained the bruises, large, deep marks across the boy's upper back and shoulders that could only have been made by someone kneeling on him. She traced their locations with a laser pointer, each point landing like a blow to the juror's sense of safety and reason. These injuries, she said, are consistent with sustained downward pressure. Someone held him in that position while he was alive. Then came the defensive wounds, tiny abrasions on his hands and fingernails, scratches made from desperate attempts to escape. He fought, she said simply. He tried to survive. The jury fell silent, some visibly shaken. Next came the lung analysis, proof that Jeremy was breathing when submerged. The water inside him wasn't the result of a fall. It was the result of being drowned with force. No impulsive shove could explain 3 minutes of conscious struggle. No moment of rage could explain the specific pressure patterns. This was controlled, sustained, intentional. And then forensic specialist Derek Winters took the stand. His testimony focused on the blood evidence, microscopic droplets on Brittany's clothing, and the biological material under her fingernails. These droplets, he explained, magnified photos appearing on the courtroom screens, occur only during active struggle in water. If Brittany had simply pulled Jeremy from the tub, the pattern would have been smeared, not sprayed. And the material embedded under her nails, that came from Jeremy scratching at her while drowning, a direct physical link between her hands and his final struggle. The defense tried to argue alternate scenarios, but Winters dismantled each one with scientific precision. His final statement left the courtroom frozen. There is no scenario in which these injuries, these patterns, and this evidence occur without the victim being forcibly held underwater. But the most devastating evidence wasn't physical. It came next, when digital experts revealed a timeline of searches that showed Brittany had planned every step long before Jeremy ever entered that bathroom. If the bruises and blood unveiled the violence, the digital evidence unveiled the mind behind it. When FBI cyber specialist Agent Rebecca Morales took the stand, the courtroom shifted again, not toward emotion, but toward undeniable logic. Her testimony was straightforward, methodical, and devastating. She began by explaining how Brittany's phone, shattered screen and all, still held the remnants of searches she thought she deleted. Using forensic tools, her team reconstructed a timeline of what Brittany had been looking up in the days leading to Jeremy's death. It did not tell the story of a sudden emotional explosion. It told the story of a plan quietly forming long before the argument at breakfast. 3 days before the murder. Can someone drown in a bathtub? How long does drowning take? 2 days before. What makes a drowning look like an accident? The morning of the murder. Do police check fingerprints in bathtub drownings? Can someone die from hitting their head in the bathroom? Each search appeared on the courtroom screens in crisp, undeniable detail. Every keystroke was a step toward the crime that would follow. Morales explained how these weren't accidental taps or curiosity searches. They were deliberate, repeated, and linked directly to Brittany's user account. Then came the deleted messages that had been recovered, texts about making Jeremy sorry, about wanting him gone, about her resentment toward him that had been building long before the phone-breaking incident. The defense tried to argue that teenagers Google things they don't understand, that fantasy doesn't equal intent. Morales calmly dismantled that argument with timestamps. These searches escalate, she said. They show progression from curiosity to method to execution. Then she showed the call logs, 2 calls in Brittany's voice impersonating her mother, one to excuse herself from school, the other to pull Jeremy out early. Both placed before the drowning, both intentional steps to isolate Jeremy. The courtroom felt colder with every new piece of evidence displayed. It was no longer possible to argue impulse. The digital trail had built a roadmap, one Brittany followed step by step until the moment she filled the bathtub. But the most emotionally shattering testimony came next, when someone who knew Brittany best revealed the dark conversations she had kept hidden from everyone else. If digital evidence exposed Brittany's planning, the next testimony exposed her intentions, long before Jeremy ever stepped into that bathroom. When Madison Taylor, Brittany's closest friend, stepped onto the stand, she looked nothing like the confident teenager in photos submitted to the court. She was pale, trembling, gripping the railing as though it might hold her together. She wasn't just a witness, she was a girl who suddenly realized she had missed warnings that now felt impossible to ignore. Madison described weeks of conversations leading up to the murder. Brittany had vented often, about school, about her parents, about Jeremy. The jury expected typical teenage complaints. What they heard instead was far darker. Madison recalled one conversation where Brittany said life would be so much easier if Jeremy wasn't around. At the time, Madison thought it was nothing more than sibling frustration. But then Brittany took it further. She began talking about wanting him to disappear. She wondered aloud whether her parents would finally pay attention to her if Jeremy were gone. Madison admitted she laughed it off, thinking it was dramatic exaggeration, the kind teenagers often use when overwhelmed. But then came the text message the morning of the murder. "I'm going to make him sorry he ever touched my stuff." Madison's voice cracked when she read it aloud. She told the court she had never imagined Brittany meant it literally, that she had been angry, yes, but capable of killing her brother. "I didn't think she'd actually hurt him," she whispered through tears. "I thought she just needed to vent." But the prosecution's timeline connected Madison's testimony to the digital evidence. Brittany didn't send empty threats. She followed them. With every word Madison spoke, the courtroom saw not just a teenage girl acting out of sudden rage, but a girl who had been thinking about harming her brother long before the phone accident. Madison's guilt poured through her voice as she stared down at her trembling hands. "If I had told someone, maybe he'd still be alive." The weight of that statement filled the room. But the defense wasn't done fighting, because next came a psychological battle over Brittany's mind, her maturity, and whether a 14-year-old could truly understand the consequences of killing her own brother. After the forensic evidence, after the digital timeline, after the emotional testimony from Brittany's closest friend, the defense found itself standing on thin, cracking ice. There was only one angle left to argue, not what Brittany did, but who Brittany was: a child, a developing brain, a teenager whose emotional impulses could outrun reason. And so the courtroom shifted from physical evidence to psychological warfare. The defense called child psychiatrist Dr. Robert Chen to the stand, calm, composed, scientific. His role wasn't to deny what happened. It was to explain how it could happen. He walked the jury through brain development, how the amygdala, the emotional center, is fully active in teenagers, while the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for impulse control and long-term judgment, is still under construction. A 14-year-old doesn't think like an adult, he said gently. They react, they feel, they explode. He explained how embarrassment, punishment, and emotional distress can trigger overwhelming reactions in adolescence, outbursts that feel catastrophic to them, even when the trigger seems trivial to adults. The defense leaned in hard. If Brittany's brain wasn't capable of fully understanding consequences, how could she form premeditation? How could she intentionally plan murder? But the prosecution countered like a blade, sliding through the argument. On cross-examination, Prosecutor Elizabeth Howard asked one simple question after another. Does magical thinking explain impersonating a parent on the phone? Does emotional impulsivity explain calling two different schools to isolate the victim? Does rage justify researching drowning for 3 consecutive days? Dr. Chen hesitated. He couldn't say yes. The planning was too deliberate, too sequential, too calculated. He admitted the truth the prosecution needed. Adolescents can still engage in organized, intentional behavior, even when emotionally dysregulated. With each answer, the defense's last shield weakened. Howard ended with the photograph of the bathtub bruises still on the courtroom screen. Is this the result of a moment of teenage panic, she asked quietly, or sustained, intentional pressure applied for minutes? Silence. Then a reluctant answer: sustained. The defense's strongest argument, the brain of a child, had collided with the reality of what that child had done. But everything would come down to the final moments of this trial, because now it was time for both sides to deliver the closing arguments that would determine whether Brittany spent her life behind bars or walked away with the label of impulsive child instead of murderer. By the time closing arguments began, Courtroom 3A felt less like a legal chamber and more like the eye of a storm, silent, tense, holding its breath. Every piece of evidence had been laid out, every lie exposed, every perspective dissected. Now it was time for the attorneys to stitch those pieces into 2 opposing stories and leave the jury to decide which version of Brittany Ringstaff they believed. Prosecutor Elizabeth Howard rose first, moving slowly toward the jury box, her crimson blazer catching the lights just enough to demand attention. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She began not with Brittany, but with Jeremy. An 8-year-old boy trusted the person who killed him, she said, placing Jeremy's school photo gently on the podium. Then she walked them through the timeline again, but this time she told it like a narrative with no place to hide. The days of online research, the impersonated phone calls, the calm walk to Jeremy's school, the staged scene. The washed clothes, the silence after the drowning. This was not impulse, she said softly. This was preparation. This was intent. And then, after a long pause that forced every juror to look at her, she ended with, Jeremy fought for his life for over 3 minutes. You decide what that tells you about hers. The room felt colder. Then came the defense. Patricia Reynolds stood before the jury with a tremble in her voice, not weakness, but emotional weight. She didn't fight the evidence. She didn't deny the tragedy. Instead, she begged the jury to see the child behind the crime. She spoke about brain science, about impulsivity, about immaturity and undeveloped judgment. She showed them photos of Brittany at 14, awkward, young, fragile. Do not let this child die in prison, she pleaded. Hold her accountable, yes, but do not pretend she had the mind of an adult when she made a terrible, irreversible mistake. 2 stories. One anchored in planning and brutality, the other anchored in adolescence and psychological limitation. The jury didn't react. They didn't nod or frown. They simply absorbed the weight of what had been placed in their hands. And when the judge dismissed them to deliberate, no one expected what happened next. The speed of their decision stunned the courtroom and sealed Brittany's fate. When the jury rose from their seats and filed out of the courtroom, everyone expected a long wait. Hours, maybe even days. A case involving a 14-year-old girl and the death of her younger brother wasn't something a jury rushed, or so everyone believed. But barely 4.5 hours later, before the courthouse coffee even cooled, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room froze, reporters scrambled, parents clutched each other, and Brittany sat rigidly between her attorneys, her face drained of color. She tried to hold steady, but her foot tapped uncontrollably beneath the table, a tiny crack in the composure she had clung to for months. When the jurors re-entered, not one of them looked at her. They stared straight ahead, faces pale, expressions heavy with the weight of what they were about to decide. The foreman handed the folded paper to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to the judge. Judge Harrington opened it, scanned the page, and his eyes gave nothing away. His voice was steady, too steady, as he read aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The words struck the room like a physical blow. Gasps erupted, a sob from Brittany's grandmother, a quiet, heartbroken exhale from Heather Ringstaff. But Brittany, she didn't cry, she didn't scream, she didn't crumble. She simply stared, lips parted, as if the meaning of the word hadn't reached her yet. Guilty? A child found guilty of the most adult crime. Charles and Heather held each other, not in relief, not in victory, but in devastation. They had lost one child in the hallway that day, and now they were losing the other inside a courtroom. Brittany's attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Breathe, just breathe." But she didn't. She sat like a statue, frozen in the moment her future snapped in half. Reporters outside would later say the verdict echoed across the state, igniting arguments about juvenile justice, mental development, and whether a 14-year-old could ever truly understand the crime she committed. But inside that courtroom, the only thing that mattered was the truth the jury believed. And now there was only one step left, because the verdict was only the beginning. Next came the sentencing, where Brittany would learn exactly how many years of her life she would lose, and her reaction would stun everyone in the room. 2 weeks after the verdict, courtroom 3A filled once again, but this time the energy felt heavier, darker, as though the very walls understood what was about to happen. Sentencing day. The moment Brittany Ringstaff would learn how much of her life she would spend behind bars. The moment Jeremy's family would speak the pain they had carried since the afternoon they lost him. The judge called for victim impact statements first. Charles Ringstaff stood, voice trembling but determined. He described Jeremy's laugh, his curiosity, his gentle nature, and the agony of falling to his knees on the front lawn when he learned his son was gone. "We lost both our children that day," he said quietly. "One to death, one to choices I will never understand." Heather couldn't speak. A victim advocate read her statement. How she still stood in the doorway of Jeremy's room at night, hoping for a miracle that would never come. How she couldn't reconcile the daughter she loved with the act that destroyed her family. The courtroom was silent except for muffled sobs. When it was Brittany's turn to speak, she rose slowly, small, thin, looking younger than her 14 years despite the suit her lawyers had chosen for her. Her voice cracked instantly. "I didn't mean for him to die," she whispered. "I was angry and I didn't think. I just wanted him to stop messing with my things." Her words were fragmented, more about her emotions than Jeremy's life. And then she said the sentence that cut the courtroom in half. "I just want to go home." Even her attorney seemed startled. She didn't understand. She still didn't understand. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his voice heavy with gravity and disappointment. He acknowledged the science of adolescent brain development. He acknowledged her age. But then he spoke the clearest truth of the trial. "You planned this, you executed it, and you tried to hide it." Age does not erase intention. The room held its breath. "It is the judgment of this court," he said, "that you be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Gasps, cries, disbelief. And then for the first time, Brittany broke. "I'm only 14, she screamed as deputies grabbed her arms. "I'm only 14, it's not fair, I want my mom, I want to go home." But there was no home left to go to. And while Brittany was taken away kicking and sobbing, the aftermath of her crime was only beginning. Because what happened to the Ringstaff family in the years that followed would reveal how one act can fracture a lifetime. After the sentence was handed down, the courtroom slowly emptied, reporters packing equipment, attorneys gathering files, spectators whispering their disbelief. But for the Ringstaff family, the trial wasn't ending. It was only the beginning of a lifetime of grief. Charles and Heather Ringstaff walked out of the courthouse shattered. They had come seeking justice for Jeremy, but justice had a cost. Their daughter would likely spend most of her life behind bars. Their home, once filled with 2 children, laughter, and normal chaos, had become a monument to tragedy. Jeremy's room stayed exactly as he left it, a dinosaur poster still tilted on the wall, a half-finished science project still resting on his desk, a pair of cleats placed neatly by the door, waiting for a season he would never play again. Heather tried to visit Brittany in juvenile detention, then later in the women's correctional facility, but each visit chipped away at her spirit. She sat across from her daughter, separated by cold walls and a conviction she still struggled to comprehend. "She looks like my child," she once told a friend, but she isn't the same. And neither am I. Charles handled grief differently. He withdrew. 2 years after the sentencing, the Ringstaff marriage dissolved under the weight of loss and questions with no answers. He moved out of state, eventually remarrying, trying to build a life that didn't constantly echo with what-ifs. Yet even in his new home, friends noticed moments when he drifted, staring into space, remembering a child who would forever be 8 years old. The community of Boise didn't forget either. Jeremy's classmates planted a memorial garden at his school, complete with a small dinosaur statue, his favorite thing in the world. A scholarship was created in his name for young science lovers, giving life to the dream Jeremy never got to chase. Meanwhile, Brittany became the subject of intense debate. Some viewed her as a monster. Others saw her as a broken child. But regardless of opinion, the fact remained. She was serving a life sentence before she had even learned to drive. One house, one morning, one act, and 2 children were lost forever. Yet even after the courtroom closed and the years passed, Brittany's story didn't end, because what happened to her behind bars would shape a chilling final chapter in this tragedy. 5 years after the trial that stunned Boise, the Ringstaff home had been sold. The memorial garden at Jeremy's school continued to bloom each spring, and the city had quietly healed around the scar of its darkest case. But for Brittany Ringstaff, once a 14-year-old girl insisting she just wanted to go home, life took on a different meaning behind the towering concrete walls of the Idaho Correctional Facility for Women. She entered the prison system as the youngest inmate in its history. Officers described her first months as unsettling, not because she acted out, but because she didn't. No outbursts, no breakdowns, only silence, a routine. A child adjusting to a world she couldn't possibly comprehend. Over time, Brittany grew up where childhood wasn't allowed to exist. She finished high school behind razor wire. She took college classes through distance learning. She read, studied, and built pieces of a life inside a place designed to hold people forever. But no matter how she changed, the weight of what she'd done was always there. Interviews with prison staff revealed a disturbing truth. Brittany never talked about Jeremy unless required. She described her crime clinically, almost academically, like it was something that happened to someone else. She understood the facts. She understood the sentence. But whether she understood the human cost remained a question no psychologist could fully answer. Meanwhile, Charles and Heather drifted further apart. Divorce, distance, new lives built from ashes. But every April, both found themselves pulled back into memory, one child buried, the other locked away for decades. 10 years after the murder, a reporter interviewed Brittany. She was 24 then, an adult in age, but one who had never truly lived outside confinement. "I think about Jeremy every day," she said. "I didn't understand what forever meant at 14. Now I do." Her eyes didn't fill with tears. Her voice didn't crack, but the emptiness behind her words said everything. She had gained maturity too late, not for her freedom, not for Jeremy, and not for the family that once held her. Today, Brittany will not be eligible for parole until she is nearly 50 years old, older than her parents were the day her world collapsed. Jeremy will never see adulthood. And the Ringstaff tragedy stands as a haunting reminder of how a single moment, fueled by anger, immaturity, and unchecked emotion, can destroy an entire family. Because sometimes the most terrifying true crime stories aren't about strangers in the dark, but about the danger no one sees coming from inside their own home.